Hello everyone, today we talk about the Irish ecclesiastical hierarchy during the 7th century. So its development from the foundational phase that we will see in other videos. We have already talked about the Easter controversy, this Irish 7th century connections with Rome, etc. And the ecclesiastical hierarchical development of the island, of the broader Scottish church is fascinating, in as much as it's in many ways underdocumented, relatively unknown. As we will see now, there's just a specific bunch of sources you can use, but also quite intricated because of the relatively paritory level that the main religious centers of the island would have, so mirroring a little bit that lay competition, obviously not, that had always existed in Ireland, with the, of course, claim of overlordship, but the ineffectiveness in the extension of such dominion. Naturally, when it comes to the church, we're talking a different type of control, but as you know, the Irish ecclesiastical organization had differed sensibly since its beginning to the essentially Romano-Germanic one. Actually, it's just Irish, because eventually also in Scotland things are developed in a different way. This has in part to do, but evidently in fact with the Scottish comparison, with the level of Romanization. As we will see, there was actually a faction probably in the ecclesiastical, in the Irish church, that was trying to, just like it would happen in England, that was in part evangelized by the Celts, but was in fact from Ireland in great part, but eventually organized, like foundationally, with some minor exceptions. A certain role of abbeys, for example, as diocesan centers, but still in the Roman way, in the Romano-Germanic fashion, right? And the reason being, of course, that Ireland suffered in terms of power concentration. There hadn't been cities the Roman way. It was very complicated for any of the clans to maintain and put in Germany, even on a provincial level. So these are all things we will see in another videos. The Irish church had fundamentally developed from monasteries that thus had acquired diocesan episcopal power, right? And so when you look at the necessary hierarchical organization of the church, you have to understand there how these monasteries interacted with one another, right? So by the end of the 7th century, and this is sort of the darkest period of all, right, in terms of documentation and whatever, we see some important ecclesiastical development having already been established, even though the evidence is sort of feeble, like to substantiate more, but we will try. Above the Tuat level, the Tuats were, as you know, some local districts, right, that would count approximately like a few thousand people, and this could be, let's say, equated to a parochial district, over which the soundest ecclesiastical powers were based. And of course, as you understand, with a limited range and reach. So there is a hierarchy incarnated in at least the claim that one single Irish church, so that's theoretically with a defined hierarchy, was at the head of all the churches existing on the island, right? Or like the offsprings, also think about the Iona, etc. But those are also relative exceptions. There were two main centers claiming this leading role. The first one was Kildare. We're talking essentially the east of Ireland, and this place had historically been important for the island's spiritual history, given that it had been the see of the shrine of Saint Bridget that would eventually, in fact, was already a saint and a goddess of fertility that was eventually turned into properly a Christian saint. We will see this in other videos better. This was a bit like, of course, there was a lot of power gravitating around the shrines, and so also the Christian communities had installed themselves there and substituted themselves to the pagan priesthood, or turned from the pagan to the Christian one, had maintained an important degree of power. Kildare specifically claimed its jurisdiction, that was in Latin called parrochia, spread throughout the entire Ireland, as they said this, from sea to the sea. This is, for example, a quote from Cogitosus, that was a 7th century, in fact, Bishop of Kildare, in his work of the Vita Brigite, so the life of Saint Bridget. Then the other important center, more connected with the more powerful one, the more charismatic in Ireland, was Armagh, right, which also claimed supremacy throughout Ireland. First of all, it's interesting in the first place that at this time in history, this idea of primacy emerged, meaning that, of course, there had to be a head of the island. That this, as we've seen, had already happened in lay politics. But there was, of course, relatively to the church, a matter of charisma, a matter of, say, a primate of charity. This is something, an important issue, for example, between Rome and Constantinople, the first always actually recognized by the entire church as the one with the primate of honor and charity. In Constantinople, making but for political reasons, not religious ones, that could hold, at least, because, especially if you call yourself a Roman Empire, you have to be clear about certain things. And this was equally connected, a bit like with St. Peter and St. Paul for Rome, with, in fact, the previous spiritual histories of the center. Because Armagh was the preferred see of St. Patrick, and so this that could be boasted also over Kildare, that was, in the sense, expressing a bit more of that ambiguity, probably, as far as the figure of Bridget was concerned. There were other political issues. For example, from Britain, the Northumbrians were claiming some, from their newly converted church, some ecclesiastical overlordship over Northern Ireland itself. Northumbria was an Anglo-Saxon power. It's one of the last we have to make the introduction for the original series to. And part of the reason the Northumbrians had interfered with Ireland is not just that they were a power to be reckoned with, and Ireland was sort of politically more fragmented and so permeable to this influence, but also the aforementioned Roman Easter controversy that had brought Ireland in, for some time as a whole, because there was a debate within the same island, but to a non-conformity with the same papacy. And I made a video about that. We do not even understand clearly what was behind it, at least explicitly. So there was both a reason of internal competition and external pressure, to some extent, to claim a primacy, right, on the Irish Church by these centers. Armagh's claims were made in the Liber Angeli, the Book of the Angel, written in the local church, that was expressing sort of more coherent ideology and sort of more cogent point for than Kildare's to boast such primacy. All right, and as we were hinting at before, most of Armagh's point was founded on St. Patrick's special connection with Armagh. The saint had, as you know, converted all the Irish, and therefore this, a bit like again, in this evangelizing function of the, say that would have been made an exception, probably a choice by Saint Patrick for Armagh, was reflecting the divine assignment of all the tribes of the Irish to the spiritual jurisdiction, as in the text is called parochia, so parish, as we've seen similarly to Kildare's terminology, of, in fact, not just Armagh, but St. Patrick himself. The interesting thing, of course, is that not just Armagh and Kildare were involved in this tete-a-tete, we can say, and yet many of these also claimed, in fact, that, say, for whichever contact they had with St. Patrick, like God had basically been showing through the saint's generosity, the predilection for the sea. However, Armagh would, as we will see now, historically remain connected with Patrick's name. It just had derived from the relation with the saint many specific rights, for example, a superior status to all the other churches within Ireland, an appellate jurisdiction, which had emerged also just by practice, because Patrick again had sort of coalesced such pole of attraction there. This, of course, the only exception was from Ireland to Armagh, to bypass the latter and ask the Roman Pope for any ecclesiastical issue. All right, so there was definitely an international hierarchy that Armagh represented for the Irish towards Rome. And this shows you, by the way, how much in the West, as early in time, like Rome was really like the spiritual cornerstone for pretty much anyone. And we will have to talk more about the fact the Celtic, the Anglo-Saxon evangelization in general. There was also a claim of special relationship with all the original Episcopal and Domnac churches. Domnac stands for Sunday, like in Dominica in Latin. These were essentially like the local parishes, like the village churches, if I understand correctly. Plus, there was an invitation to all monks to abandon their own monasteries and join Patrick's, because of course also before St. Patrick there had been Christians. In Ireland there had been different other, let's say, groups, the organization of which we're not fully aware of, but again, given the prestige, the charisma, the authority that St. Patrick had, the idea is that Armagh was like the place, the center. I also made a video, I don't remember the title, it was from some years ago, showing how concretely the Celtic spirituality passing from paganism to Christianity had retained this great sense of like the, interest for concrete miracles, for the power of the relics that were already, like in paganism there had been all a transformation that had paved the way to Christianity in the first place, in some practice, in some just mindset. It's wrong to call it paganism, or to say, for example, that Catholicism was existing only with Christianity, but we will talk about Irish so-called paganism in another video. So all these ideas, of course, show how truly hierarchical the ecclesiastical order of Ireland was already seen, right? So with the Archbishop of Armagh at the apex of that hierarchy, at least for the local church, and the other churches, in fact, having a lesser status, subordinated status to the same Patrick's Church. So there is another level of ecclesiastical organization aside from the higher one for the entire island that essentially was between, in fact, the top, the single one, and the Tuatha small-scale provinces, as we've seen. So essentially an ecclesiastical authority that had to be at the head of multiple Tuathas, and so like ruling over the churches of the single ones instead. Thus a diocese, basically. There is this important source, the canon, right, which we will comment especially in the end for the sort of historiographical dismissal that was at some point in history, like saying, and this especially because these documents come from the Roman synods, let's say, from that faction that was trying to, in fact, represent a more hierarchical structure with titles, etc. And today, instead, we're discovering was real, right? That there was quite an ecclesiastical hierarchy. And in this source, at least in one of these canons, that are very difficult sources to study in the first place. I will not digress of how complicated the sources are for the way they were drafted, just like how, when, in which context, relative to the synod, but also how they were stored, how they were put together, whether they were copied. It's a mess, I know. One person specifically researches this for a living, and it's shocking in many ways. In any case, to make the long story short, there would be only one metropolitan bishop of the small-scale province, covering perhaps as many as 4 tuatha, so something like 12,000 people. There was, however, some sort of higher grade of bishop above him as well, which existed thus as yet another level between the Irish over church, we could say, and mirroring essentially at a political and social level one of the major over kingdoms. Now the problem in the sources is that the Latin terminology uses sometimes like the generic province for each of these levels, so you do not know exactly what we're referring to, but these over kingdoms would be Leinster, Munster, to give an idea about this. This comes from the Collectio Canonum Hiberniensis, the 20th, as a matter of fact. Again, very difficult sources to understand. There is a work by Charles Edwards from 1992 and 2000 that sort of at least expresses this sort of this layers, right, of ecclesiastical hierarchy. We don't have to scratch our head too much after all, because there is not so much specific information about this ecclesiastical levels of organization. We can simply see, however, that the canon sources seem to imply a very similar system, actually, compared to the one existing in continental Europe, right? So it's as if, again, yes, Ireland had a different infrastructural basis for the ecclesiastical administration, but in practice, like the hierarchy of the same was transposable, could be overlapped with the Romano-Germanic world. So you would have a few over-bishops that were all of equal status because they represented this provincial level. And it's hardly visible anything like a truly single hand of Ireland. Again, Armagh, Kildare tried that, but de facto, like the hierarchy stopped at this sort of over bishops that were in turn that were again from especially the most politically cohesive part of the island, and that were at the heads of some other metropolitan bishops. That is an attempt from the more powerful churches to federate the smaller ones, right? To de facto subject them, right, to at least their ecclesiastical administration, therefore tying them clientelly to the center. This was particularly seductive in Ireland, given the monastic foundation of the church, and so the let's say that the possibility of literally, as we will see, this was especially the case of Iona, that was particularly centralized, right? You know, we're talking western Scottish seaboard, but that's in fact quite an exception in itself. The Irish had much greater. I mean, those were Irish themselves, but I mean, in Ireland, there was a much greater problem in actually, as much as the lay authority had, like to confederate any larger power than a provincial level in the first place, and especially in an ecclesiastical context that should have been at least more peaceful, especially to oblige some of these communities to actually recognize one authority over the other. Actually, it was a degree of violence in this context, let's say, even within the church, but in this sense, aside from the church. It's just how, Gaelic culture really was. We made multiple videos about Irish warfare that sort of should have explained what the background here. In any case, we see this attempt to confederate the smaller churches as a sort of accepted principle. I mean, it makes sense in a traditional society to have a hierarchical control. This is quite explicit in the aforementioned Liber Angeli from Armagh, right? So the patricians, we can call them like this, were absolutely fine with that. And every church has a hierarchy in the first place to work. And especially in the Liber Angeli, we see the foundation of this principle connected with the same one of the saint. That is, grouping together all the churches founded by the same saint and his heir as a bishop, fundamentally. So as a monk, let's stress this, so that also as a often like a rule writer, so the establisher of a certain community that had to maintain, in fact, standards that were, for Ireland specifically, in this at an ecclesiastical level, again overlapping with the monastic one, much more distant from the outer authority of the church. I mean, if something was going wrong, say in Italy or Gaul, things were, like, these centers were much more connected with the world, with one another. They were much more dynamic, sort of punching, powerful systems, so things were easier to, let's say, there could be conflicts. Actually, in the West, not much in the first place. With, as we were saying, with Constantinople and Rome, it's the whole West, as you know, that would lead on a longer run to a schism and very important differences. Ireland was a bit like out there on its own. And so, as we've seen with the Easter controversy, if there was some problem, this could last even for generations with no, say, possibility even from the papacy to intervene directly, and for reasons that were actually just a problem, a shortcoming of the Irish Church in its development. It was gradual, like even difficult, but ultimately successful. As we know, also thanks to the international guidance, right? And the sort of the Orthodox Universal Party always prevailed for that matter, because it's sort of the only thing that makes sense. So here today we don't minimally talk about the lay patronage of these centers, because otherwise it becomes too messed up, and we do not know too much about it here. But you can, say, sort of predict what dynamics were present behind this, right? So this group of churches under a bigger one would be called, again, the aforementioned parochia. So the idea was, as a parish, to be under like a same jurisdiction, which is not exactly what we intend by parish in, say, for example, in outside of Ireland in this context, like in this with this Latin terminology. Now, there was thus a competition and even a shady business about claiming one church to have been established by this or that saint or one of his monks, right? So there would be literal factions within the Irish church that were struggling, fighting about this. This, on the longer run, favored the bigger churches because, of course, even if at a smaller level, for some reason, you're claiming take greater power in virtue of like a famous, the foundation by a famous bishop or whatever, unavoidably there was somebody you had to go at the root of. So Armagh would be happy of all the foundations of St. Patrick claimed, also sometimes when this was not true, because at the end of the day this reinforced its own power. And Armagh was so confident in this that after all it didn't even need to enforce directly its own authority. Right, in order to lure a bit the Episcopal and Dominic churches / parishes, they would simply say, well, we will allow you, because we are Armagh, you see, we are St. Patrick, to choose freely your own head, right? Rather than we imposing it one on you, right? And this just by the fact of being declared, just being like in contact with these centers, immediately placed many churches under Armagh's influence, right? And even this liberality at the end of the day brought many churches, actually most of them, to simply not just accept, let's say, just to Armagh's rule, but even properly feeling invited within it and allowing the same Armagh to choose their own, to choose itself for them. This is evident, for example, in the Episcopal Church of Sletty, when the chief church of the Birr in southern Leinster, I will be butchering the Gaelic pronunciation, but this was southern Leinster was a tuath of significant importance, where in the late 7th century put itself under Armagh. And again, this meant for the lay authority as well to secure a part of stability, a part of assets, because the churches were controlled by these guys anyway. So this, by the way, the episode of Sletty is important because Kildare was the other papal candidate, right? They were trying to get Sletty, and Armagh in this way took over, right? So there was always like a battle with one another. As a consequence, there would be at some point several federations of churches, parochia, the most important ones being the ones of Armagh. Also Clonmacnoise, for example, was quite powerful. The normal factor involved, like it was the proximity of the parochia itself. That's the case for Sletty and Armagh that we just exemplified. But let's say everything was based on more or less on the same provincial subdivisions of Ireland, and so trying to compact the local church on the base of that. So you can almost map these with a relative ease, after all, for the times and places. There's an interesting distribution and affiliations that we know of. For example, there was the Columban Federation, the one of Columba of Iona, not to confuse with St. Columbanus, then the one of Armagh, and so on. We also don't know, of course, about many churches, literally, whether, there are some that probably even died out at some point during this time, and we have no idea during the many disputes that existed between the various episcopal center to whom every single church that we are aware of belonged, but this goes without saying. So one could ask oneself, but how did they make it work? Like, how could, for example, Kildare or Armagh both having like this claim, at least to the Supreme Church in Ireland? Well, it's the same question you get posed to Constantinople or Toledo, right? Like, how did they think that they could, for example, be more important than Rome, or what was their direction? Of course, there were contingental political interests, visions of their own church. Here we're talking about, again, pretty small scale after all. There wasn't a major big ecumenic plan like for those churches of Southern Europe. In any case, the aim, in fact the most concrete one, was to reinforce a provincial structure was being built exactly at this point. So it didn't really matter whether there was no single Supreme Bishop of all Ireland, like as there had never really been a true single king recognized by everybody at a political level. But the function of a bishop, at least the hypothesis of the same idea, the fact that this was a goal to reach, and that of course there was an ultimate authority over the Irish Church within Ireland, besides the larger level, the papacy, of course, was a normal consequence in the intentions of these ecclesiastical centers. Also, we shouldn't take, in fact, so seriously the formal definition of these claims, because the institution itself was pretty precarious. For example, we cited before the assertions of cogitosus in the Liber Angeli. All right. So one thing is claiming, another thing is actually having that capacity. And in part, of course, it does exist. So it's not to say that claims are disjuncted from the capacity. But the degree by which, of course, they are going to be accepted Irish-wide is another matter. And again, it's not even a matter of material range. It's just like essentially the moral dimension of politics and how these centers interact with one another. In the Liber Angeli, you see explicitly Armagh's refusal to accept Kildare's claims as expressed from their own side. There is another author from the time, Tirecham, which, albeit writing his work on behalf of St. Patrick's Church's cause, openly states that, like other churches in Ireland, we're not accepting Armagh's claim, right? So this is also a complaint that shows how, of course, there is a legitimacy to that claim in the first place, defending it, but showing, in fact, that there is someone who's not doing what they should be doing and opposing that. Status, in many ways, would make these relations way before than we can track in chronicles or even from the canonical collections. However, there is no doubt that by the late 7th century, Armagh was recognized really as a sort of first among equals, even in Munster. So the spiritual prestige of this center had de facto won, like the hegemony over Irish morals and identity. And again, this didn't mean simply that it was like considered like totally in control. It was still like the main center in relative terms, but there was also something qualitative about it, something at again higher level, just like the Roman supremacy that existed well before the Gregorian reforms, and in spite, in fact, of the claims of other centers to have some sort of superiority, even when denying even the commonality, such as the assembly of the bishops over the single center, whatever. So there was always a great deal of ambiguity, depending, of course, on which side you were. Right. Now, speaking of the canon collections, like those, as we were saying before, are very complicated sources. And in Irish historiography, as far as I understand, there was a point in time in which essentially this type of sources, again, are very, very difficult to analyze, were seen mostly as the expression of the Roman party that was trying to impose in Ireland a more continental hierarchical system on the Irish church, which was also the objective of many of these churches themselves, also at a collective level. This would happen historically at some point, but these were not the times yet for Ireland. In any case, there was a bit of like these guys were just say convening in these synods because they wanted to show that they had more power than they had. They used titles that seemed too hierarchical. We shouldn't trust them. Instead, more recently, Irish historiography has come back on these sources, has looked at them better, as it always happens at some point in history, and said, you know what, this stuff is very important. It shows, definitely, even just by looking a bit at the same characters, the names, the role that they likely had. This happens also through other disciplines. Like there are ways to define single individuals, their connections, etc. It's admittedly difficult in 7th century Ireland, but when these texts refer to, for example, such figures like bishops of bishops or supreme noble bishop, right? Even though they're relatively flexible terms, because again, also the synods were not just saying, okay, we have to make up a categorically, in fact, a non-existent office, right? They are objectively describing a historical reality. There were definitely different ranks in the episcopal hierarchy, which corresponded to an actual function in the Irish Church. And this is quite interesting, if anything, also for political reasons, because you understand that behind these bishops there were powerful families, powerful clans, that was all a merciless game of power, which used the church as well for its ends. One interesting as messed up consequence of this situation that is showed to us by later annalistic obituaries is that bishops could have a particular area, could cover more than one tuat, sometimes a province, but not really being recognized at a higher level or by these same communities, right? So it was in many ways just a claim. In fact, it's a bit like seigneuries. The fact you can't quite draw them on a map accurately. It's a matter of influence and just of political capacity, claims, maybe a legal recognized right that, however, did not match with the actual power of this prelate, right? So we have these over bishops in a province, at times not tied to a specific church either. This does happen also on the continent sometimes, because also bishops were not from the same background, and they could own these offices for different reasons, for different times. We have later sources from the 10th century telling us that both Mael-Moedhoc of Kilsheim and Amcad of Kildare, the first died in 917 and the latter in 981, were both recorded as Archbishop or Bishop of Leinster. So you may not exactly understand whether it was a fully categorically recognized level of over bishopric, and we would just recognize that. Of course, there were synods, but in general, we can think that these claims were also autonomously fostered. So that's where fundamentally we remain. This maybe were just titles they gave themselves for a matter of personal honor, maybe just because of the true background they came from, like they were more important people, or just endowed with greater power at the time. They would be recognized like this. And this would be typical even of lay ranks, like in the vassalic beneficiary hierarchy, like in the same 9th, 10th century. You could be a count, then recognized by the same king, literally the same king in office, first as count, then as duke, then back as count. Like this was surely part of the game after all. We just remained with all the uncertainties of the case, of how the Irish church was actually organized, with a hierarchy of levels. We just see the broader picture, but not the exact details of it all. Speaking of the federations of multiple churches, the parochie that we mentioned before, we can confidently assess them being sort of the most evident reality. As we were just saying, in spite of the federation, such churches were not necessarily or just so strongly affiliated to the single church of a particular overkingdom, right? Federation could happen for many reasons. We must think being part stemming from a common rule, a common order, but also a need for defense, even sometimes. When we look at the greatest churches, Armagh, Kildare, and Iona, we see how there are many churches under them, but they're also widely scattered to some degree, which corresponds to the level of control that existed on particular centers, their location. Just think about how, I don't know, coastal connection made it much easier, right, for, say, in the Irish Sea, for example, to interconnect one another. In the interland, things were a bit more complicated. Some, again, we have problems with documentation. We do not know exactly how many completely churches existed out there, and the various associations would take forms that are hardly documented as well. It was definitely commoner in general for the majority of dependent churches to be, however, close to the neighboring dominant church, right? They would just seek more protection and stability from that. We see it, for example, with Cork having a cluster of churches all around it, connected to the local one, the central one. There were ties between different federations that thus could enact some broader cooperation, some important provincial level. To some degree, of course, this encompassed all Ireland. It also regulated contacts on the outer side. It was just not temporary. It was not just, founded on a rigid formal institution that we can categorically identify as structural and systemic. Also, when a smaller church became part of a federation, it wouldn't necessarily just lose its own identity or rules or specificity, right? This is particularly the case for the Irish interland. Like Iona, for example, had a very centralized system, right? It was this familia, so the family, the community of dependent churches that were ruled by priors appointed directly by the same Iona, and the monks of the same familia, in fact, of monasteries being sent from monastery to another, but within the same system. Iona is an exception, as we were saying before. It was very centralized. It had developed just in very different ways. It, as you know, was the launch pad for the conversion of the Scots historically. There is like a very different. Also logistical, apparently the way probably the Scottish, the Irish element were pouring into Britain from like in the north from Ireland, had maintained this kind of unity of command, etc. But the Irish Isle was very very different, right? They were much more autonomous. It was much of a also individual interest, even in, for example, economical activities. Like the various churches had land, and they would confederate also to be part of a broader trade circuit, which still reflected an important individual ambition of the single groups. Of course, this on the longer run would provide with the capacity of centralizing more, but the progress, like for example in the development of some form of tribute from church from lesser to greater church, was for a long time very symbolic in nature, right? Not much of a burden in practice. So again, just as Irish society as a whole was not particularly stratified, nor the churches were particularly placed in a sound hierarchical fashion, or one that could simply oppress each other individually to a great degree. All right. The church could be the Episcopal Church in itself could be subjected to a monastery. Sometimes there were these kind of relations and protections, right? While remaining, for example, the Episcopal Church of the single Tuat it served, but being connected, say, to a more important monastery somewhere else. So again, at a local level, these federations would often leave an important degree of autonomy. All right. So we have tried to outline this system, which, as you understand, is actually simpler than it sounds. Sources, especially the canon ones, the one of the synods, are pretty articulated, complicated. You must just be a specific expert to study them, to understand them carefully, because just the way they were compiled, the way they were preserved historically, copied, it presents such a mass of philological, historical, codicological, paleographical issues that you have no idea of. In fact, I prudently remained outside studying warfare. Like it's messed up in other ways, but of complexity, let's say. But it's sort of more positively, let's say, approachable to the degree you're interested in it, of course. So yes, this is essentially the thing. Like the Irish church was still fundamentally based on monasteries. The most important bishops ruled from these, effectively. There were other churches under the latter's control. These groups were called paroukia in the local Latin terminology. The various groups had sort of similar status, at least the heads considered themselves at this recognizable level. In the 7th century, say the beginning of the 8th, Armagh was by far the most important of these churches. It had a great prestige because of St. Patrick's legacy, lots of lands, lots of churches that were federated under its supervision, and it would receive, in fact, an important attention from St. Kings of Ireland, donations, like broader, political involvement, and this was not surely what the Liber Angeli was suggesting in terms of the actual hegemony of Armagh on the entirety of Ireland, which would have been prohibitive in the first place, but the power acquired by this church was definitely a big deal for Irish standards. in the 7th, the 8th centuries. And in this sense, hope was the last to die in terms of expanding further this power. We find even instances in which, of course, there were more powerful individuals at a time than the Armagh's bishop. For example, in 700, Adamnan was a scholar from the Columban Federation we mentioned before, and this is actually the most important thing. He was fourth cousin of the O'Neill Overking, right? So one of the most powerful noblemen in Ireland. Well, in this sense, the guy was more powerful than whoever, because I don't think we know that, headed the Federation of Armagh in the same year. And there is a proof, that is the Synod of Birr in 698, in which Adamnan succeeded in issuing a regulation that safeguarded the clergy, women and children from the endemic warfare that was ongoing among the Gaels continuously. This looks like a sort of peace of God of some sort, as they would actually emerge in the later centuries in post-Carolingian Europe, places like France. Like the assertion of a sort of privilege that now the church had acquired, and the clergymen with that as a matter of status, and also naturally the people that lived on this land. Of course, if they needed to issue this law, it is because evidently the clergy, women and children often suffered of the violence of the various fiannas, of the incredibly violent, in fact, war bands and the feuds that tore apart the country. But what matters at this synod is that this was not just an ecclesiastical thing, right? There were dozens of kings as well as prelates attending it and conferring, like accepting, of course, as a broader, convention, the protection of the weak. In this case, that weren't too weak, at least in the sense this church was able to even defend itself to some degree. And the same bishop of Armagh was there, leading this group. So Adamnan, he was himself the great abbot of Iona, right? Again, not an unearthed of random center. So as we were just exemplifying, actually the most centralized, still capable of having this influence on Irish mainland affairs, right? And so this guy was acting as a sort of leader, right? That the same Bishop of Armagh was sort of following this phase of the early Irish church. So I think this is a very interesting topic in general to highlight. It shows you all the complications, it doesn't stop here. We could make, as I was saying at the beginning, especially a video on the interference of lay politics in the Irish church, and in part the Synod of Birr sort of highlights the consequences of that involvement. So there is always a lot to uncover. I would like to talk a bit more about British and Irish history. I just want to check how many Irish, because I've talked too few about this stuff. I would like maybe here British and Irish. Wait a second, because I have a playlist that combines the two. Medieval Britain and Ireland, here it is. And it's 69 videos. Overall it's too few. Like with others, I have other single European countries I surpassed even multiple hundreds, so... But there is a lot of interesting stuff, telling the truth. but there is, like, especially for English and Scottish history, well, okay, for all of these, for all the three kingdoms, let's say, and more, the poor Wales. I made something about Wales, but in on Irish history specifically, yes, we made recently that video about medieval Irish warfare. That's fair, 10 videos. 11 with this one. We'll hopefully go on. But for today, we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.